It may have lost the election, at least in part, because of its climate change policies, but Labor is certainly not going to run dead on the issue as a result. Anthony Albanese has come out swinging today, accusing the Prime Minister of misleading the United Nations, or in his words, saying things that don't match up with the facts. The Labor leader has signalled today that he is prepared to fight on this issue of climate change and clearly sees it still as a vulnerability for Scott Morrison, despite the election results, particularly in Queensland. Here's what's concerned Anthony Albanese so much. Here's what the Prime Minister told the UN in New York.
Australia's internal, though, and global critics on climate change willingly overlook or perhaps ignore our achievements, as the facts simply don't fit the narrative they wish to project about our contribution. Australia is responsible for just 1.3% of global emissions. Australia is doing our bit on climate change, and we reject any suggestion to the contrary.
It was a punchy performance, a defensive performance, at least on this issue of climate change. Scott Morrison argued emissions in Australia per person are the lowest in 29 years. That's not contested. He also highlighted emissions from the electricity sector have fallen. Well, that's not contested either. What is disputed is the Prime Minister's claim that Australia's commitment to reduce emissions by 26 to 28% by 2030 is going to be achieved. Anthony Albanese says that's plain wrong.
His speech in New York, in which he argued that Australia was performing well when it comes to action on climate change, simply doesn't match up with the facts. The fact is that Australians' emissions have been rising since 2014.
Anthony Albanese says the facts are emissions will keep rising. They are rising right now, will keep rising until 2030. That's according to the government's own data, he says. He went on to say there was a big increase in renewable investment thanks to the renewable energy target, but that's now halved this year. So who's right, who's wrong in all of this? Well, it is true emissions per person have come down, but overall continue to rise. The government says that's only because we're exporting more gas to the world, which is cleaner than coal, so should help bring down global emissions. Either way, the government should be able to achieve its Paris target because it's using so-called Kyoto carryover credits, which Labor says it shouldn't be counting. Bottom line is, there's no political settlement now on climate change. Doesn't look like there will be if today is any guide. The fight over this will only continue. Labor is not about to roll over, despite some suggestions it should after the election result. The opposition's also seized on this latest report today from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a report specifically on the ocean and cryosphere, the frozen parts of the planet. And it's based on the peer-reviewed work of more than 100 scientists. This report says the cryosphere is shrinking and the rate of melting has only accelerated. According to the report, take a look at it, it says by the middle of the century, we'll see extreme storm surges that currently happen every century, happening every year. By the end of the century, more than half the permafrost will be gone, and sea levels will rise by, at worst case, between 60 centimetres and 110 centimetres. That's 10 centimetres worse than the earlier IPCC report.
This report is incredibly confronting and dangerous for Australians and for the Australian way of life.
We'll come back to this IPCC report a little later. I'll be talking to an oceanographer and climate scientist from the Australian government's own Australian Research Council. If the Prime Minister was defensive on what his government's doing on climate change when he spoke there to the United Nations, he was more on the offensive when it comes to tackling plastic waste and saving our oceans. In fact, he toured a huge recycling facility in Brooklyn, owned by the Australian company Sims Metal. Scott Morrison has talked a lot in recent months about doing more on this issue of plastic waste, and he told the UN he wants Australia to be a leader in combating this problem.
Protecting our oceans is also one of the world's most pressing environmental challenges. To protect our oceans, Australia is committed to leading urgent action to combat plastic pollution that is choking our oceans, to tackle over-exploitation of our fisheries, to prevent ocean habitat destruction and, of course, to take action on climate change.
He said the government will invest $167 million in an Australian recycling investment plan.